Welcome, everyone. Today we have a special guest, Lisel Hintz from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Lisel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm as well as I can be during the quarantine. Firstly, I want to thank you for letting me interview you today. I want to introduce you briefly to the viewers, if you don't mind. Lisel is an assistant professor of international relations and European studies at Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in political science from George Washington University. She works at the intersection of identity politics and foreign policy. She's kind of focusing on the relationship between domestic politics and IR, and specifically how domestic identity struggles spill to shape and be shaped by international affairs. And her regional focus is on Turkey and its relations with Europe and the Middle East. And that's why today we wanted to have an interview with her. First, I want to start with your piece on Washington Post Monkey Cage. It was a piece about the rap song by Şanışer called Susamam. I'm a great fan of rap music. I was just listening to all these rap musicians before they got famous. I just remember that they were just uploading some amateurish recordings to some underground websites, and I was just listening to these songs, these recordings. That's why I was totally interested in your piece. And I think this song was a creative way of speaking up. You know, we live in a country where it's not possible to speak up freely, so we need to find some creative ways of speaking up. And I think rap music is one of them, absolutely. So what do you think about how rap music can affect politics in general? And do you think that the Susamam phenomenon affected Turkish politics and the authoritarian tendencies in Turkey?
Yeah, thanks for the question and for your interest in that piece. That's probably my favorite thing that I've ever written. It's fascinating. I think it's a fascinating topic. I think it's a powerful one. I think it speaks to hope and resilience in a time when there are not, as you rightly mentioned, a lot of avenues or a lot of channels for open opposition in Turkey. And I think rap in particular, so my new projects are sort of all focusing on the intersection of politics and pop culture. So I look a lot at television shows and films and novels and graffiti and art and music of different forms. But I think rap specifically, A, because of its appeal to youth, B, because of its kind of challenging the establishment ethos, and I think because of the rage is a tough term to use, but I think its ability to be able to convey a very powerful set of emotions of frustration, of rage, of grief. And I think you see all of that in the Susamam compilation, which was put together by Şanışer, Sarp Palauer, but also a number of artists that he gathered. It dropped at the exact same time, and apparently this was totally coincidental, according to Sarp, but as has Olay, which was much more visually impactful, like scenes of conflict and death and destruction. The Susamam compilation was a number of different rappers and then artists of a different style. So you had like Deniz Tekin, who's the only woman who contributes, who has this ethereal voice talking about women's, violence against women in this really kind of surreal and creepy way. So I think rap, in its ability to bring together different musical styles, you can have mashups, you can have different voices. I think in its appeal to youth, I think in its ability to express frustration and rage and grief and all of those emotions that last September, so many individuals in Turkey were feeling. You've seen a spike in incidents of violence against women. You've seen, increasing concentration of power in the executive. You'd seen a mayoral election in Istanbul, annulled when the opposition won. The opposition won again, but just this sense that, for a lot of Turks, things are going in the wrong direction. And I think that rap specifically provided a really powerful forum for those artists to convey those frustrations and for them to resonate with Turks who, didn't necessarily know how to articulate or where to articulate those frustrations, but had a fantastic platform to do so.
Exactly, yeah. I think it was a great night for many people. Ashel and Shanshar, they did it. I mean, it was a coincidence, but it was a good coincidence for us.
Yeah.
In terms of the video content, Ashel's video was great. In terms of the lyrics, Shanshar's song was great with all other rap musicians. And after they released this song, Shanshar was in DC for a scholarly conference after he released the song. I was wondering the process, like how you got in touch with him, or did he get in touch with you? How did he end up giving a talk in a scholarly conference in DC as a rap musician?
Yeah. This was one of the coolest moments of my life. I can definitely say that. So the way that it happened was Gönül Tol, who is the outstanding director of this sort of Turkey program, the Turkey Center at the Middle East Institute in DC, reached out to me because she knew that I'd been working on the intersection of politics and pop culture, and she had this idea for a panel on art in the age of authoritarianism. And I thought, that's exactly what I'm working on. I'm fascinated by, the ways in which citizens, even in highly constrained environments, highly authoritarian regimes where, the streets are kind of closed to protest, can find creative ways of articulating their dissent. And I thought this would be, it's going to be kind of controversial probably, but I think this is going to be an excellent panel. And so she suggested that Shanshar would actually come. And I was like, are you kidding me? That's amazing. But he did. And then we also had the fantastic seminal scholar, sociologist, Ayrıca, who participated. And then someone that I knew very well, Kenan Sharp, who is an outstanding writer on all things Turkey music, all things Turkey pop culture. They all came together at this panel, as you say, which was like academic policy. I've participated in dozens of these panels, and, they range in topics, they range in levels of excitement, but I think, when you walk on stage to a panel and there's a screen with a rap video playing and you've got, a guy decked out and he's ready to talk and share his truths and his experiences, I think it was a unique moment certainly for me, and I hope for those who were there and those who were able to watch it online.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a unique moment for me as well. I watched the video later on, and I just thought that if I had known that before, I would have come to DC just for this conference. Absolutely.
I love it. We got to publicize it more.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I want to switch to your book. Can you give us some information about your book? Like, what is the research question? What is the argument? How could we position the argument in IR and foreign policy literature? What kind of methods did you use? What is the conclusion? These kind of details.
Absolutely, Ferhat. Thank you so much for asking. So I thought I'd do a little reclam for my book. Thank you for asking. In fact, the methods that I used for the book, which is called Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity Contestation and Foreign Policy in Turkey, actually rely quite a bit on pop culture as sort of an alternative data source for getting at understandings of identity that, particularly as a foreign researcher, I might not otherwise be able to access. And so it started sort of making me think about the way in which pop culture serves as this empirical window onto debates that often, researchers in general, and particularly in constricted or repressive authoritarian regimes, but also, not just foreign, but someone who's an American and who automatically is going to raise suspicions, doing ethnographic field work or surveys or interviews in Turkey. That being said, thanks to a really, really generous group of people and a great network, I was able to do a lot of field work via the snowball method. But I also used novels and films and songs and other sorts of alternative data sources to extract these understandings of identity. So what's the book about? Identity Politics Inside Out. So The picture on the cover is a picture that I took on July 15th, 2017. It was about like 1 in the morning, and I'm standing in front of the parliament in Ankara waiting for Erdogan to come from Istanbul and give his speech on the 1-year anniversary of the coup attempt. And as the picture sort of shows, obviously, Turks are going to know this, but the parliament is located at the intersection of Atatürk Boulevard and İnönü Caddesi. The sort of founders of Turkey, what I call the Republican nationalist founders of Turkey. They have a very specific understanding of what Turkishness looks like. And I would submit that the scene that I saw in front of me, in front of the parliament, this institution that was meant to sort of carry out those ideals in governance and society, that they would not have been happy with what they saw, which was a lot of the women in hijab and, a lot of people continually screaming Allahu Akbar. And it wasn't, I think, the vision that they were trying to create for their society. And so my sort of puzzle is both at the domestic level, how did understandings or prevailing understandings of Turkishness change so quickly at the societal and institutional levels? And what role did foreign policy play in that? And so I break down these understandings of identity into 4 different versions of Turkishness, or proposals for Turkishness, essentially. Republican nationalism, so like secular, Western-oriented, sort of norms of gender equality, suspicious of the West, but definitely part of the West, and wanting to ensure that we don't have any sort of ethnic politicization of identity other than some, version of Turkishness. Having gone through the Balkan Wars and First World War, ethnic nationalism was something that they wanted to erase. So that's Republican nationalism, which was prevailing in the military and the judiciary and the presidency, and was tried to be instilled in society as well through the education system, through the media, and so forth. And then the second main proposal for identity that I discuss is Ottoman Islamism, which is, by the way, different from Neo-Ottomanism. I don't use that term. I find that to be, I know it's common parlance, but I find that to be kind of anachronistic, because Neo-Ottomanism was a policy under Turgut Özal, and it actually had a relatively positive Western component to it that the AKP's current proposal for identity does not have. So I very explicitly separate from Neo-Ottoman discourse and talk about a vision of a Turkish individual who is a pious Sunni Muslim, who respects patriarchal norms of society and governance, and sees Turkey's foreign policy as rooted in its legitimacy as former home of the Caliphate and the Sultanate. So Turkey should be, this can vary by context, but either the Muslim leader in the region or the Sunni Muslim leader in the region, and other powers should respect Turkey because of its cultural and historical legacies. So how does Ottoman Islamism, perhaps superficially, but relatively, symbolically represented in dress, in norms of behavior, in what's allowed on the media, in legislation, in education, what's changing? How does that come to dominate these institutions so quickly? How does the AKP, which comes from this anti-Western tradition of political Islam in Turkey, the Milli Görüş movement, how do they come from a tradition that had all of its political parties closed, that had its only majority government or its only coalition government deposed, its parties shut down? How do they succeed? How do they survive? How do they stay in power? And how do they then disseminate those norms of identity into society, into institutions, and manifest them in foreign policy? And I basically, very briefly, talk about the foreign policy arena as an alternative contestation area, whereby when you basically have your identity proposal blocked at the domestic level, that is, your parties are being shut down, your narratives are not in the textbooks in school, your voices aren't on the media, how can you combat those institutions? And I look at how the AKP selectively uses EU democratization reforms to weaken and then reconfigure the military, to weaken, or I should say reconfigure the judiciary, all of these different sort of institutional reforms that they undertake, and then the economic reforms that they undertake that help the Islamic bourgeoisie rise and then become a very strong political actor within Turkey as well. So basically kind of taking the fight outside to try to neutralize or weaken or marginalize your Republican nationalist obstacles back home. So that's basically the idea of the book, is looking at how domestic politics and foreign policy intersect, and how identity proposals that maybe face obstacles at home, whether it's like a constitutional prohibition on religion in a political party, or policies that seem to be undermining secularism, or it's a ban on an ethnic party. All of those institutional constraints you can, in some ways, fight if you have institutional conditionality or leverage to do so.
Yeah, great. What you're saying is, in general, the theory and argument part of it. And I want to ask a question about the methodology part as well. You put forward pop culture as an alternative way of analyzing politics, and actually an alternative way of data. So you're focusing on Turkey, but we can use pop culture elements for any political analysis of all the countries all around the world. So how do you think pop culture provides us with reliable data to analyze politics? And can you say that it provides us with reliable data in such authoritarian countries as Turkey as well?
Yeah, so really good point. I use a lot of pop culture in addition to surveys and interviews and archives and all that good stuff, as an alternative data source in Turkey. But of course you can use this in other countries as well. And this is, by the way, nothing new. Like, media studies scholars and cultural studies scholars and anthropologists have been doing this for a very long time. It's just not a data source that is very widely used in political science. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is kind of, as IR people, we borrow from economics and history and psychology and sociology and all of those disciplines. And I feel like, particularly in accessing marginalized voices, accessing alternative voices, getting at those issues that maybe foreign researchers might not otherwise have access to, that pop culture, kind of almost like James Scott's concept of hidden transcripts, you get a little bit of insight into those discussions that you would otherwise not be privy to. So one of the scholars that I cite in political science in IR who has done this in the Russian and Soviet cases is Ted Hoff, looking at social construction of foreign policy and threats, and sort of both in the Soviet era and the Russian era. And he looks a lot at novels. And he suggests expanding it to other forms of pop culture as well. So that's what I've done a little bit with music and film and those kinds of things. In terms of reliable data, that's a really good question. What I'm not trying to do is find generalizable trends. I'm not trying to find statistical significance. I'm not trying to find representativeness. What I'm actually trying to find is competing voices. And so I use something called intertextual analysis, where you kind of compare texts, you compare how they discuss a particular subject and parse out the differences across it. So how is Kurdish identity discussed in this film or this novel or this song? And what does that tell us about the individual who's writing it? So one of the sort of precepts that you start with is that none of this is objective. Of course, that's the whole point. It's subjective. It's one person's point of view. The question is how many people share that point of view. And that's where you kind of have to get creative in terms of, if someone views a video online, do you count that as support? Well, maybe not, right? Maybe they view it and they hate it. If someone watches a movie, does that show that if the numbers of, Fethi 1453 are super, super high, can we sort of extrapolate from that support for an Ottoman Islamist understanding? I never try to make those very direct correlations. But what I'm trying to do is get a picture of what's out there. So I'm not going to say that 57% of the population has an Ottoman Islamist identity because 50% of the population went and saw this. Like, I don't believe that you can do that kind of causal inference. I don't think that's useful. But I do think it's useful in getting at contestation, getting at debates, getting at sensitive issues, getting at emotionally fueled issues, and getting at marginalized voices that you may not see on mainstream television. And this is the other element. When it gets to television, so online sharing of rap music is one thing. Depending on how online sharing platforms are constrained in the future in Turkey, of course, that's up for contestation right now. But television access is a different thing, because there are, of course, a number of different private channels in Turkey ever since the liberalization in the 90s. But you have these very, very dense networks, links of political and financial and banking and construction interests that are linked to the holding groups that own these media networks. So you're not seeing a whole lot of proliferation of different kinds of voices, as you may have, say, 10 years ago. So that's something that's really important too, looking at kind of the what the media landscape looks like and what are the avenues for self-expression. Where is self-censorship happening? Where is formal censorship happening? So the question about reliable data, I think, is really, really good. But it depends on what it is that you're looking for in terms of the sort of results that you're trying to extract. And for me, it's not about, you know, statistical significance. It's trying to map sort of what are the voices and what do they stand for.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I totally agree with you about this. It mostly depends on what kind of a theoretical structure you're using. Like you referred to Ted Hobbs' book. It was a book written from the perspective of constructivism. Actually, when I read the introduction part of your piece, I came up with two things. The first one was this book. I just tried to position the argument in the book in IR literature, and I just thought that it's very close to Ted Hobbs' book. At the same time, you're referring to Scott's Hidden Transcripts. It's a book from comparative politics. And also, I just came up with this idea, like the way Scott explains the uprising in those countries by focusing on hidden transcripts. You're doing something similar as well. And you're saying that these data are subjective, but I think you're conducting the method in a very good way. And actually, I think you're coming up with a intersubjective idea about this. Like, these are subjective things, but when the reader reads it, it's just like, you know, I think it could be not objective, but it's something intersubjective in between subjectivity and objectivity. So I think the way you conduct the method was really important at this point, I guess.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I agree in terms of the intersubjectivity and looking, again, using intertextual analysis to find differences, not looking necessarily for similarities, but to try and find, like, what are the points that people really are angry about? What do they fundamentally disagree about? What's the, like, yeah, ne olursa olsun, I would never do that, right? What's the identity red line is something that I talk about. So I think that these forms of pop culture are really useful to identify those. And I like that you point to both James Scott. So he's got, you know, an incredible breadth of literature, but Weapons of the Weak is the one that I draw on the most in terms of what are the strategies that, or what are the, motivation can be tough, but what are the practices that individuals who, even in a super repressive regime or peasants, you know, in a feudal system, what are the tactics that they have to be able to kind of symbolically erode the power of the, you know, their feudal lord or of the authoritarian government or whatever it is, as well as to kind of like boost morale amongst themselves. So I do very much draw both from the comparative politics side of protest studies, of social movements, of you know, behaviors of individuals within repressive regimes, and then looking at the IR constructivist side. So in the book, I try to talk about how I blend those two and really try to erase this, what I think is an arbitrary and relatively counterproductive divide between comparative politics and IR. And I think we need to speak to each other a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. It was great for me to read this book. Like, it's at the intersection of comparative politics and IR at the same time. So I want to ask some questions to you about your piece in Apsamena newsletter. It's an interesting piece for Turkish people because probably you follow Turkish movies and series, because you refer to the movie Fethi, you refer to even Medcezir, a Turkish series. You refer to Muhteşem Yüzyıl, and you refer to Kurtlar Vadisi, these kind of things. And it's totally obvious that you're familiar with Turkish series and movies. Can you talk about how you became interested in using those movies and series in your political analyses?
Sure. There's two factors that contribute to it. One is completely random, and the other is sort of what is the official inspiration. The first completely random one is that I was holed up in my apartment in Dikmen, trying to figure out a way to learn the Turkish language better than the classes I was taking at Tomasz, and they were great. But I wanted something more vernacular. I wanted something more conversational. I wanted to understand how people actually speak. And I also wanted to engage in passive learning, because sometimes you're just exhausted and just can't sit in the classroom all day. So I would just, turn on Star TV or Show TV or whatever channel, random, kind of not looking for anything specific, but just to see what would pop up. So that was the first thing, it was a language acquisition strategy. The second is the first piece that I ever wrote in foreign policy was on, I think I called it Reading Turkish Politics Through a Soap Opera. And it was in December of 2012 when I was in Ankara, and I had been there, I guess I was like 4 months into my field work. And there was this big debate in the news about how President, then Prime Minister Erdogan, had, during some probably opening of some, I don't know, construction site or whatever, had made a speech about how he thought that Muhteşem Yüzyıl was insulting to Turkey's national history, that Sultan Süleyman was on horseback for 30 years and he never engaged in the kinds of palace intrigues and, all the stuff that made that series so popular for people, the women with the cleavage and the idea that maybe he's drinking from a goblet and the conspiring behind the scenes and all that kind of stuff, and Hürrem's character and the machinations. And he just said that this was, insulting. And so he said something judicially must be done about it. And I was like, that's nuts. Okay, so what's going on here? And then I was really interested in how political parties reacted to it. So the main opposition party kind of has this like, oh, you're criticizing, consumption of alcohol, or you're, things that would constrain secularism, let's say. That, and also the fact that he was overreaching. So as main opposition party, that made sense. That like fit into where I would think a main opposition party focused on secularism would make their complaint. The Kurdish actors were kind of saying, but this is infringement on cultural rights, and this is infringement on expression of, culture and so forth, which of course makes sense if you're worried about the constraints on the expression of your own culture and language and so forth. And then Devlet Bahçeli of the MHP is like, "Şimdi mi aklına geldi?" Like, oh, really? It only came to his mind right now. So he's accusing Erdogan, of course, of changing the agenda. And of course, the agenda was the secret talks between the government and the PKK, right? So I was just fascinated that the different political parties reacted the way that they did to this particular soap opera. And I was like, I can look at one piece of pop culture and I can get really good insight into the political dynamics of what's going on. So that was a little bit of how I started getting into it.
Oh, great. And the earliest series among these that you mentioned was Kurtlar Vadisi. I mean, all Turkish people were just watching that. I just remember those days we were all watching that together, and everybody the day after it was released was talking about this. And it's famous that everybody says that, okay, the first 97 episodes were great, but after that, people started not watching it. So after the first series, they released a movie called Kurtlar Vadisi Iraq. It was a movie about the hood event, like the American soldiers captured some Turkish soldiers and they put some hoods on their hats after the Turkish parliament rejected the US proposal. I mean, allowing the US to use the military bases in 2003. And actually this movie was a propaganda movie in which a Turkish character called Polat Alemdar took revenge of this hood event. And some American actors acted in it as well. Later on, they released another movie called Kurtlar Vadisi Palestine. And this movie became a problem between Turkey and Israel. So my question is, how could this kind of movies affect the relationship between countries, or could they?
Right. So this is one of the most fascinating aspects also. One of my questions, of course, is why do countries care about, like, why does Erdogan care about what's on television? Of course, it may have been the attempt to change the agenda, but he's also promoting, at least I would argue, a very kind of Ottoman, pious, Muslim-centric identity, and he doesn't want that compromised by a television show that's focused on something else, that's kind of denigrating in his eyes the history he's talking about. But then why do, leaders care about how their countries, or, perhaps imitations of themselves, are portrayed in media abroad? Why are they so focused on that? If it's just entertainment, why do we care? And one, there's a bunch of different examples of this, but one that I think Turks would relate to is there was an episode of Designated Survivor, which is a US TV episode US TV series starring Kiefer Sutherland. And there was an episode in which a character very much resembling Fethullah Gülen is portrayed extremely sympathetically. And that was a problem even for the embassy in DC. And they raised that issue. Speaking of the Kurtlar Vadisi and Israel, we know that it's what I call chairgate, when I think it was the Deputy Foreign Minister, Danny Ayalon, has the Turkish ambassador called in to have a chat about the fact that Israeli soldiers and civilians are portrayed in really horrible ways, objectionable ways. And they seat the Turkish ambassador in a really low chair, and there's no Turkish flag on the table. And the deputy foreign minister looks at the camera and says, "Look, do you see? There's no flag. Look what I can do to my counterpart." Yeah. And it's those kinds of like symbolic diplomatic incidents that can really raise a lot of tensions between countries. And it was over a soap opera. It was over a piece of pop culture or a film. So I find these incidents super, super fascinating. So one of the levels of analysis that I focus on that comes out of the Apsamina piece that you read, but that's the book manuscript that I'm working on. I'm looking at politics and pop culture at different levels of analysis, and one of them is the international level, and looking at how states are perhaps more than we expect focused on promoting and policing particular images associated with their own national identity. And so if there is an objectionable, portrayal in a series, they raise it with the ambassador, or they create their own series. So in response to, say, Diriliş Ertuğrul, Resurrection Ertuğrul, and some of the other Ottoman and proto-Ottoman or pre-Ottoman focused series that have become so popular, you have the, Saudi and Emirati produced Kingdoms of Fire, which is meant to kind of counter the Turkish narrative of Ottoman glory and expose Ottoman tyranny, is how the producers, I think, referred to it. So there's actually quite a lot invested in, not just promoting soft power, which is what we often think of Turkey's soap operas do, or their television series doing, promoting soft power. You have, I don't know how many tourists coming from, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to see where Nur was filmed, Gümüş was filmed, right? So you have that soft power element, but you also have this contestation and like othering behavior that can happen through pop culture, where you try to control the narrative and push back at what you're seeing as negative portrayals of yourself. So it's much more serious than we would think, or states take it much more seriously than we might think.
Exactly. I agree with you about this. I think the Turkish government takes it very seriously. You mentioned the designated survivor. Probably you heard that the Turkish government wanted ask Netflix to censor this specific episode, and they censored it last week. So probably
last week. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, last week they did it.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay.
And I don't know how it works, but it doesn't make sense to me, because probably not many people were watching this series in Turkey. But now with the news, they were all aware of this episode, and probably people just wondered what it is, and they watched the episode because of this censorship.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating timing. Yeah, I'm going to have to look into that. That's a puzzle. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Okay, now I want to ask you some general questions about Turkish foreign policy as well. President Erdogan said last year that S-400s would be activated in April, and it wasn't activated. That's why people have started to talk about S-400 problem these days. We're talking about it, but actually it's only a little part of a bigger problem. It's like about the fact that Turkey has been breaking off its relations with the West and specifically with the United States. But also at the same time, Erdogan is behaving very ambiguously, like he's kind of trying to create a balance between the United States and Russia. Do you think that this policy is feasible to continue, like on the long term? And do you think that Russia is a good alternative for Turkey to turn to?
Yeah. So this, I think, is a really important question. And I'm working on a paper right now, actually, on looking both at the U.S. side, essentially a deterrence failure, because there was a lot of political and diplomatic capital invested in trying to deter Turkey from the S-400 purchase, and that failed spectacularly. And there's a number of reasons, focused mostly on, I would say, mixed messaging. So Congress was pushing very, very hard for sanctions. Congress at this point, and Turkey can send all the personal protective equipment it wants, but it's not going to make Congress forget the fact that for a long time Turkey refused to return or free Pastor Andrew Brunson. And that Turkish security officials beat up protesters, and as it turns out, U.S. Security personnel as well, in front of the Turkish ambassador residence. So that goes back a long way. But Congress was pushing very hard for sanctions, and President Trump was essentially telling Erdogan that, don't worry about it, I can fix this. You're not going to necessarily you're not going to face those sanctions. And the fact that the CAATSA sanctions, or the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that should have automatically triggered sanctions through the purchase of the missile defense system from Russia, has this, let's call it, loophole whereby it's the president who determines which sanctions and when they are applied. So that's the deterrent side. But on the Turkish side, and this is actually the part that I want to emphasize, is that Turkey has very much been pursuing a strategy of carving out a much more independent role for itself in foreign policy. Part of this has to do with what I spoke about earlier, becoming sort of a Muslim or Sunni Muslim leader in the region. But there is an anti-Americanism component that is by no means new in Turkey. The AKP does not have a patent on anti-Americanism, which is actually why it plays so well, because there are a lot of factions within a lot of different, ideological or identity groups within Turkey that are extremely frustrated with the way that the U.S. has treated Turkey, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Cyprus to 2003 to the 2016 coup attempt, and the way in which at least the Turkish media has portrayed that the U.S. has not been cooperative in extraditing Fethullah Gülen, and on the night of the coup was not particularly forthcoming with support for the Erdogan regime either. So there's a lot of, I think, suspicion and resentment and frustration that go along with that. So this kind of move away from the US and an attempt to disentangle or sort of liberate Turkey from US influence or pressure, this sort of strategy to try to ensure that Turkey is independent and isn't beholden to the US, doesn't have to do what the US does. I think there's a lot of that kind of motivation that is behind the S-400 purchase. I use a frame whereby I argue, and it's a little bit similar to the IMF, I can talk about that in a second, that Turkey, through Erdogan's rhetoric, he's painted himself into a corner rhetorically on the S-400 issue. He can no longer back down. For a long time, the US wasn't certain whether he was bluffing or not. They were able to turn Turkey away from a potential Chinese missile defense system purchase. And I think that the US government thought, or the foreign policy making establishment thought, that Turkey was bluffing on this. And we don't know necessarily whether there was an intention from the start and it has remained 100% constant. We won't know that, and we may never know that. But what we do know is that despite multiple threats of sanctions, Turkey hasn't backed down from it. And I would argue that its relationship with Russia, and you alluded to this, and I think it's a really important point that you make, that Turkey's kind of balancing, US and Russia. which can backfire, as we saw in Idlib. It can backfire in particular circumstances. But that through, energy ties, through needs to access Syrian territory, Russian-controlled airspace, and so forth, that Turkey has become sort of embedded in a relationship with Russia that it doesn't necessarily have it doesn't have the ability to extract itself from that, even if it wanted to. So I think it would face a lot of reprisal were it to back down from the S-400. And so that, I think, is sort of a corner that Erdogan has painted himself into, partially in trying to demonstrate how very independent Turkey was from the US, and now kind of getting entangled in a relationship with Russia that it finds itself difficult to extract itself from. I would just super briefly, I would say, I think the IMF is a bit similar, that Erdogan has said so many times he will never go to the IMF. And I don't think it's just about the structural adjustment, or I don't think it's just about the policies of transparency and accountability that would need to be implemented. I think it's about the symbolic significance that that's taken on. And if he were to then go to the IMF, he would lose a lot of credibility. And so he's, you may think, oh, well, maybe he's trying to avoid Western institutions. Well, he's going to the US to try and get swap lines. So it's not just about Western institutions, it's about the fact that he's repeatedly pointed to the IMF, just as he repeatedly pointed to the S-400. And I think once you have kind of rhetorically entrapped yourself that way, it's very difficult to back down, even in the face of what's happening to the lira today. But
yeah, exactly. And while Erdogan is sending mixed signals to the US and to the West, I just wonder how Trump would behave in the future. Like, we will have elections in November, if not postponed because of the pandemic. And in general, American presidents behave differently in their first and second term, because in the first term, they have to think about being reelected, but they can behave more freely in the second term because they don't have such a concern of reelection. But again, Trump is a total deviant case. I mean, it's really hard to predict what he is going to do. So my question is, if he gets reelected in November, how would his foreign policy to Turkey be like? Do you think that the Turkish-American relations could get any better in the future?
Thinking about Trump getting reelected is a terrifying headspace. But it's a very important, in all seriousness, it's a very important question to ask. And you're absolutely right that he's a deviant case. I teach a class on psychology and decision-making in foreign policy, and we look at things like experience and leadership style, and belief, like operational codes, personality, all of that. And he's off the charts in many ways. In fact, he was even off the charts in his first term. We often see, for example, presidents change their cabinets, they change their advisors. And Trump is not so unique. We hear about him changing like 4 national security advisors, 3 chiefs of staff, right? But normally those changes take place exactly as you're talking about in this period in the run up to the election, because they want to put forward a new face and correct any mistakes or disassociate themselves with mistakes that they've made earlier in their term. But Trump was, making changes 2 months in. And so that is something that's quite different in terms of leaders, advisor networks, and so forth. In terms of what foreign policy would look like if he were reelected, there actually are some common threads, common driving themes. One is distrust of alliances. Another is very competitive trade deals. And so I don't necessarily see a big change in US-Turkey relations from what we see now, which is completely divided, in the sense that Trump is sending messages to Erdogan that, and in addition to that, in terms of themes that are common to Trump, I would say his affinity for what I call hyper-masculine, nationalist, populist strongmen, because why not have a really long term for it? You know, if it's Putin or if it's Erdogan, if it's Orban, he has an affinity with these individuals and he respects their control. And he goes to, you know, speak with Kim Jong-un and he says, I want my people to react to me the way that they react to the North Korean leader. So I feel as though there's not necessarily anything that's going to change on his level from being willing to listen to Erdogan. We know that following phone calls, Trump significantly reversed US policy on Syria after speaking to Erdogan, twice actually. So I don't see that dynamic changing. I also don't see Congress's frustration with Turkey changing either. I think that there would need to be a very drastic change in Turkey's stance. And in the same way that the S-400 has become kind of a symbolic prop for Erdogan that he can't back down from, it's become a red line for Congress as well. So without movement on that issue, I don't see a lot of room for any kind of rapprochement or amelioration of the tensions. You know, what you have, I think the appointment of, you know, Ambassador Jeffrey as the point person on Syria was a gesture to Turkey. He's known in, you know, Turkey circles as being relatively favorable to Turkish interests. But again, you know, there's only so much that he can promise in terms of US support for Turkey that's not necessarily going to be forthcoming. You know, Congress is not necessarily going to approve all of the measures that Turkey perhaps would want. So I think we would just see a continuation of the same unless there were a very significant shift within Turkish leadership, a significant shift on the S-400. I don't, but then again, I don't want to say that things are going to stay the same and have that mean that Trump will always be favorable to Turkey. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that things are dependent on his personality and his kind of whims. So yes, he can listen to Erdogan, and yes, he has an affinity for him and can be favorable to his interests. But, you know, when he's told something that he doesn't like, he can say, I'm going to crush your economy and I'm going to impose, you know, aluminum and steel tariffs on you. So I don't mean that everything will remain the same in terms of policy. I mean it will remain the same in terms of erratic decision-making, mixed messaging, divided policy interests, and a lot of tension that results from it.
Yeah, exactly. We're all talking about Trump in this point, but you referred to the Congress, and I was just shocked when I first came here and I saw that Republicans and Democrats, they're thinking about anything very differently. But the Turkey issue might be one of the few things that they're thinking similarly. So it's a danger for Turkey, actually.
So much, despite so much of Turkey's lobbying to the contrary, Turkey has spent so much money in DC. There are so many firms that are committed to trying to promote Turkey. But exactly as you say, it's like one of the issues that they're united on. Yeah,
exactly. These are the questions I have for today. Do you have anything to say more?
No, I really appreciate the discussion. I think you've done a fantastic job of weaving together a whole lot of themes, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And it's been a pleasure to read your work and get to know you through the Apsamina piece that you've written. And I look forward to seeing that in publication soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a great interview for me as well. Thank you for letting me interview you today. So this is the end of the video for today. Have a great week, everybody.
Sağlıklı kalın.